Hello, I'd like to welcome you to the second panel of today's webinar on Pompe disease. The session is entitled Closing the Gap in Pompe disease, Where Are We Heading? My name is Rich Saul, and I'm of WuXi AppTech. I'm very pleased to be moderating the session with my colleagues here. And with me today is two leading experts in the field of Pompe disease, Dr. Priya Sunil Krishnani, the CL and Suchem Professor of Pediatrics, the Division Chief of the Medical Genetics at Duke University Medical Center, Jordi Diaz-Manera, Professor of Neuromuscular Disorders, Translational Medicine, Genetics, the Honorary Consultant in Clinical Genetics at Newcastle University. And joining us today are two Pompe patients, both of whom represent patient advocacy organizations. Tiffany House, Chairman and Board Member of the International Pompe Association, and Brad Crittenden, Executive Director of the Canadian Association of Pompe. So in today's discussion, I'd like to cover several points. The first being demystify for our audience, take a high-level view of Pompe disease for that audience. Secondly, look at the evolving roles of patients and patient advocacy in Pompe disease. Explore opportunities for better diagnosis and treatments, how technology may impact partnerships, and also bridge future gaps. And then finally, examine or explore future outlooks and directions. So as we begin, I'd like to have Priya and Jordi discuss first the state of the disease today. Well, Priya will go first, and regarding the education of our audience, can highlight some of the key features of the disease and what makes it so challenging, and tell us about the state of the care from a physician's perspective.
Sure. Thank you, Richard, for the kind introduction. And this is truly a very wonderful time in the field of Pompe disease. A lot has evolved from its original description to where we are today. Definitely would like to first clarify the nomenclature. Pompe disease in the original description was really primarily for those with the infantile form of the disease with significant cardiac involvement. Today, Pompe disease encompasses the entire spectrum of patients who have acid alpha-glucosidase enzyme deficiency or GAA enzyme deficiency, which when deficient results in an accumulation of lysosomal glycogen and the protein manifestations as we see it today in individuals with Pompe disease. So coming back to the definition of what is Pompe disease, as you asked, it encompasses a spectrum from the infantile at one extreme to patients that can present in the 5th or even 6th decade of life, what is known as late onset Pompe disease. So for further clarification, broadly, Pompe disease is classified into infantile onset Pompe disease and late onset Pompe disease. I'm going to try and focus some on infantile Pompe disease. So these are babies who have cardiac muscle hypertrophy or cardiomyopathy, which often is present right at birth, even before birth if an ultrasound is done. But often when the baby is diagnosed is the point at which the hypertrophic cardiomyopathy is noted on echocardiogram or on chest x-ray. So this presence of cardiomyopathy is the distinguishing feature between infantile onset Pompe disease and late onset Pompe disease.
Yeah, thank you so much. So, Jordi, can you tell us a little bit more about the late onset and some of the unique challenges in terms of either diagnosis, treatments, and then cure possibilities, right? Care, and care as well. Yes.
Yes, of course. So, as Priya was just saying, late onset Pompe disease affects patients that can present at almost different ages, from pediatric patients to adult patients. So the typical case with late onset Pompe disease would be a patient that is between 30 and 40 years old that will develop a slowly progressive muscle weakness affecting first the pelvic muscles and also the axial muscles, so muscles of the spine and also abdominal muscles. And these patients are also going to develop more or less degree of respiratory involvement. But this is the typical clinical picture. It's true that we can also see patients that start younger. So for example, during the adolescence, and then you can have patients that have a predominant axial involvement with scoliosis, This is the typical one. And then we can also have patients that have only an onset of the disease late in life when they are 60, and then they have a mild involvement of the pelvic muscles. So although most of the patients follow a typical pattern of involvement, it's true that there are variants and there are different streams of the disease. You were asking about challenges. In the case of late onset Pompe disease, for me, there are several challenges. Probably one of the most important is the diagnosis. This remains a challenge nowadays because most of these patients are going to develop slowly progressive symptoms that sometimes are not even noticed by the patients. So when they present to the doctors, they are already weak and sometimes are confounded with other limb-girdle muscular dystrophies or other causes of myopathies, and take some time to make the diagnosis. So I would say, and probably Priya will agree with me, that the disease is not difficult to diagnose once you think on Pompe. So if you think that the patient that you are facing can have a Pompe disease, it's not a difficult to diagnose disease. The main issue is that it's a rare disease, and this means that not everybody is aware of the disease, and some cases can be missed. So that's one of the challenges. And in terms of treatment, as Priya was saying, I agree with her, we are living a good moment because we have already a treatment that is available for patients with Pompe, two treatments that have just finished successfully clinical trials, and they are going to be available in the next years. And we have a lot of research in terms of gene therapy and clinical trials that are now ongoing with these new treatments and new approach. So I think that although it's true that there are some limitations in the treatment that we have at present, the future is good because we have these new treatments coming.
Yeah, if I could just add, Richard, to what Jordi said, it's the diagnosis is actually so simple today as compared to what it was in 2006, when we were all working towards a treatment, a definitive treatment in terms of enzyme treatment for Pompe disease. Prior to 2006, patients were diagnosed if they could get a skin biopsy done, and then that skin had to be grown up, to what we call skin fibroblasts, sent to a tertiary care laboratory, which has expertise in doing it. So that's 6 weeks already from the time a skin biopsy is done to by the time it's grown up and sent to the laboratory, and then you get a result, or it was done via muscle biopsy. And then, with complete tribute to Dr. Chamolis from Argentina, a dried blood spot assay was developed for Pompe disease, and that really has revolutionized the ability to diagnose patients very quickly with a turnaround of 1 to 2 days from once the dried blood spot is obtained and can be done. In fact, that's what's being used today in the arena of newborn screening, taking advantage of that dried blood spot assay technology. So it's just having the physicians, that's each one of us, think about Pompe disease in our differential, and then, the actual diagnosis does not take time at this time.
Yeah. We often get questions on diagnosis, and I know on the U.S. side, Priya, we work with you very closely when patients have difficulty getting a diagnostic test done. Do you think there is ever a reason today to do a muscle biopsy beyond informational? I mean, should it be used for diagnostic purposes, especially in the case of confirmation after a newborn screen?
Absolutely. So I think Jordi, as a neuromuscular physician, will agree with me that there is a role for muscle biopsy, but I don't think that role is for diagnosis, because in fact, if a muscle biopsy is done and we're basing the results like histology findings, we often miss a diagnosis of Pompe disease. And there are several patients that I follow at our institution at Duke that were initially missed based on a muscle biopsy. Now, if the muscle biopsy is being used to further understand disease pathology and pathophysiology and mechanisms, absolutely, I think there is a role for muscle biopsy, but not purely for diagnosis. So it's a very good point, Tiffany. And maybe we should ask you, how was your diagnosis made? And also, Brad, how was your diagnosis made? Sorry, Rich, but I just think for the audience to know the journey that our wonderful patient advocates have been through themselves.
I think mine was made by muscle biopsy and then confirmed with skin biopsy. However, to your point, and to Jordy's, by the time I was diagnosed, my breathing was like 50% of normal, and I was quite severely affected. So I think the issue of not finding it through the pathophysiology, that was not an issue. It was very clear that the muscle was affected. So it was picked up through the muscle and then actually confirmed it due through a skin biopsy.
Yeah, I had so many tests done during my diagnostic time that really it all added up to the diagnosis. But I think that the real confirming test was the muscle biopsy. There were a number of things, like I had high liver enzymes and my CK was quite high. There's a lot of things that kind of pointed in that direction, but I really think it was the muscle biopsy.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much for your comments and thoughts. One question I have is it's a monogenic disease, but there's a lot of mutations that occur on that gene that give rise to the disease. Is there any kind of association between the mutation which is found versus the severity of disease?
It's a very polymorphic gene, and there are mutations that are scattered throughout the gene. And there's new mutations and new pathogenic variants, as if we were to use appropriate nomenclature today, that are being uncovered, especially because of newborn screening. And so it's very rare that you find a patient with the same combination of pathogenic variants. So for the infantile form, it's a combination of two deleterious mutations. And there is a very rich database, out of the Netherlands that can be looked at also to find out of the available mutations or pathogenic variants that have been published on. And so they continue to catalog and update it. There are also many in the US now that are being done that continue to catalog these pathogenic variants. For the late onset mutations, at least if we take a very US and Europe-centric approach, about 60 to 90% of adults with Pompe disease or with late onset Pompe disease have what we call the leaky IVS splice site mutation. But if you think of the rest of the world outside of US, so outside of people of Caucasian descent, they don't have that IVS splice site mutation, and they have a combination of other mutations which could give them a late onset phenotype. So yes, there is some genotype to phenotype understanding, but being a geneticist, I always think of it now, we are in an omics world, and there are so many additional factors, even within the Pompe gene, but outside the gene, that can modify the phenotype of an individual. And I'll let Dr. Manera also add to this.
No, thank you, Priya. I think that you have explained this perfectly fine. So it's true that we have several new mutations every year that have been discovered. So the number of mutations in the gene are just increasing and increasing. For example, we have just done a study in Spain collecting 100 patients, and we have identified 20 new mutations that are affecting families sometimes. You have just two mutations that are in that family and have not been described before that. So that is not uncommon in this gene. We don't really know why there are genes that are so susceptible to have many mutations, and there are others where this is more rare. But in the case of Pompe, the GAA gene is highly susceptible to be mutated and to develop a variant that can lead to disease.
Okay, thank you so much. So I'd like to move to the role of patient advocates and advocacy. I'd like to address this next set of questions to Brad and Tiffany. And you're both a patient and you're a leader in patient advocacy. So what have been some of the initiatives that you've undertaken and how they've helped in making a difference for patients? How has it been impactful for them? And also, what have you done in terms of patient care? So let me ask, I'll go to Brad first, and then we'll go to Tiffany.
Yeah, thanks, Rich. When I think about our activities, whether I'm looking at things that we've done or things that we're planning to do, I always go back and take a look at two of the terms in our mission statement. We don't often look at our mission statements, right? But I really try to do that. And they're education and community. So we take our responsibility for education quite seriously, but there are a lot of different ways to do that. And one of the ways that we have now that we didn't used to have is social media. Social media isn't just people posting pictures of what they had for dinner last night. Pompe patients do that too. But really, it provides us with a lot of opportunity that we didn't have before. We can post an article on our website and get it out on social media to reach really the world community, not just the community in Canada. So we can do that. We can share campaigns between organizations to try to build awareness. That's all good, but it's really important for us as well to participate in the conversation that's happening. There's some very active groups on Facebook that seems to be the most active for Pompe disease, up to thousands of people. So these are quite big groups, and it's a way for us to get out there and be in touch with the community. It's a way for us to gauge what is important to our families. We may think something's important and we might be wrong, right? We should always be willing to listen. So that's very important. When I think about community, I think one thing that we sometimes take for granted is that I think most of our organizations do patient meetings where patients and families have an opportunity to get together face to face. And we maybe don't always appreciate how important that is. Like, that is so important. I know when I was diagnosed, it was years before I saw another Pompe patient. And it's the same thing for a lot of us. Now we have social media, so we're able to reach out and connect where we couldn't before. But it's not the same as face-to-face.
Thank you, Brad. Tiffany, let's add into that, please.
Sure. Yeah, I think I have two hats that I wear. On the one hand, there's the national hat with the U.S. organization, and then I have my international hat. But I think, to Brad's point, the Pompe community is truly an international community. And I think that is something that through my advocacy work, I have continuously stressed in just about every conversation I have. Nothing happens in a bubble in the Pompe community. And I think that the advent of social media, honestly, though, it started back in the late 90s. There was a listserv for Pompe patients that had hundreds of patients on it. And from there, that grew into the different Facebook groups. But the community has always been very active and involved in sharing information, asking questions, sharing stories. And we also have a fantastic relationship with the medical and scientific community that collaborate with us and share with us. So, I think the main things for patient advocacy that are the most important are creating awareness, supporting patients, and learning more about the disease. It always strikes me that there is so much we still don't know about Pompe. To Priya's point earlier, why is it that two patients with identical mutations can have such very different outcomes? Why is it that two siblings can have very different outcomes? And we don't know the answers. So I love that we're still learning and still working, and I think that those are some of the most important things that we need to continue doing.
Okay. Question back to Brad for a moment. As a patient advocate, what do you see as some of your biggest challenges? And let me ask you, a subset of that, is it only limited to patients, or do you have easy access to physicians, and are they equipped to really handle rare diseases such as Pompe? And the last part of that question would be, how is your patient organization addressing these gaps that may exist? Start with Brad first. Yeah.
Thanks, Rich. Because we have a pretty small number of patients in Canada, we've got between 60 and 65 diagnosed, a lot probably not diagnosed, but diagnosed, we have about 60 to 65 patients in Canada. So we don't have a huge barrier when it comes to communication. I really think one of our biggest challenges is that, you know, it's not only in our country, but I'm sure in most countries, we've got large centers where we have clinicians that have an opportunity to get a lot of experience, not just with Pompe disease, but many diseases. And they see a number of patients and patients with diseases that are similar. So it builds up that expertise, and that's really important. Where in smaller centers, you know, the physicians, they just don't have access to that. They don't see the patients, the number of patients. You know, I can remember talking to one, and he said, you know, all I remember about Pompe disease was just a little bit I read in a book when I was in med school, and I can't actually remember it coming up again. I mean, it was taught in more general terms, I guess. But it's just because they don't have that opportunity. You know, in bigger centers, you have a chance to, you know, be involved in clinical trials and different studies and research programs that a lot of these physicians just don't have a chance to do. So I think there's an opportunity for organizations like ours. Now, we don't have access to this group of doctors or clinicians, but we can partner with organizations that do, and we can bring patient experience to that, which I think can go a long way in helping them understand the disease. And I think it'd be very interesting, actually. I think they find it very interesting because everybody wants to diagnose patients quicker. Everybody wants to.
Thank you. Tiffany, you have a unique perspective because you're involved both, let's say, domestically as well as internationally. And what have you seen to some of the challenges and along those lines, are you making in your estimation, making progress between, you know, this domestic versus international boundaries?
Yeah, the domestic is very similar to what Vlad was saying. You know, there are ways to communicate with patients. I think the hardest thing that I find is when patients don't come to you for help, and you find out about something and you think, if you just come to me, we could have helped pave the, you know, path for you. There are resources that we have. There are relationships we have where we can help get the correct information into the hands of patients. And that is critically important because, as Brad said, if you are lucky enough to live right next to an expert center, you should be great. If you live near Duke or anywhere that has an expert center, you're fine. You have that access to treatment and experts and advice. However, if you don't, you're at the hands of a physician that may have never heard of Pompe, maybe reading it in a textbook. And so it's a matter of getting the right combination of physicians that are willing to learn, physicians that are willing to collaborate, and patients that are willing to advocate for themselves. On the international side, I think we look at the big picture. Each country has their own issues, but it's always a matter of fighting to make sure that everybody has equality of information and trying to advocate for equality of access to treatment and care. And those are challenges because each country has its own regulatory scheme, its own reimbursement scheme. And so I think that that's something we're doing to continue facing in the years to come.
Okay, thank you so much, Tiffany. Let's go back to opportunities for better diagnosis and treatment. So let's start with Priya. So what do you see as some of the challenges then in terms of diagnosis and treatment from your perspective?
So in terms of challenges to diagnosis, Rich, I think we touched upon this. It's more thinking about the diagnosis and doing it. The second challenge to diagnosis, I would definitely point this out, is that there is something what's called a pseudodeficiency allele. So that results in a decrease in enzyme activity, but that's in vitro, so outside the body, but it's not really impacting or causing disease. So I have been a very strong proponent from the outset that we need to do confirmatory testing through sequencing of the gene to ensure, by at least now 2 methods, right? You've got a low enzyme activity, you've got a patient that looks like they have Pompe disease, but now you're also doing sequencing or mutation analysis to get that confirmation. And then, you could move forward with different treatment approaches as they are indicated. They are definitely getting there, but if there is a large deletion, so to say, in the gene, and if you don't design, the way the sequencing is done, you could miss some of these. So these are just some barriers that I think we take it for granted in the developed world that this can be ordered, but sometimes this does remain a challenge in other parts of the world. And in terms of treatment, there is definitely a therapy, which is FDA and EMA approved, that is life-saving, has changed the course of babies with Pompe disease, has stabilized and improved many of the adults or, children with the late onset forms of the disease that have ended up on treatment. The challenge really is access to that treatment and, how do we make sure that patients can get the treatment even after diagnosis is made. Cost remains a huge barrier, and then also access to a facility or a provider that can do an intravenous treatment because it takes 3.5 hours, in addition to the time that's taken to mix up the drug, formulate it, and then provide it to the patient.
Yeah, thank you, Priya. So I agree with all what you said. Is in my opinion, the molecular diagnosis is needed. In all the cases, it's very important to confirm that you have 2 mutations in the genes. It can happen sometimes. This is rare, but in 2, 3, 5%, we don't really know how many patients do we have. The mutations are hidden, are more difficult to identify. And in these very specific cases, you have biochemical confirmation, and it's going to be a little bit longer to have a genetic confirmation because you need to do other techniques rather than just Sanger sequencing. This could be more complicated, and this can be one of the challenges sometimes. As I said, this remains a rare situation, but it's true that can happen, and then we need to know that. In terms of the access to treatment is what Priya was saying. So I think that we have a treatment. This treatment works. We can be more or less happy with the outcome of patients that are under treatment. Of course, it's a treatment that saves lives in case of infantile onset Pompe disease patients. In terms of the adults, we would like to have a treatment that is able to do a little bit more, of course. But the reality, and I think that this remains one of the main challenges, is that especially with adults, when patients arrive to the clinics, it's sometimes too late and they have lost a lot of muscle. So it's true that the treatment stabilizes the remaining muscle, but it's not recovering the muscle that is lost. So if we see a patient that is already in a wheelchair and needs respiratory support, the treatment will keep that patient that way, but it's not going to improve the situation too much. So this, unfortunately, is something that is not going to be solved with gene therapies, probably, because the muscle lost is gone. So we need to work considerably in order to increase awareness of the disease and be sure that these patients are diagnosed earlier.
Thank you so much. Why don't we move on to technology and partnership? And Brad, we'll direct this towards Brad and Tiffany. If from your eyes, in your angles, how has technology played a role in education, collaboration, and also, I think you touched upon this a little bit earlier, dissemination of proper information, or getting rid of the getting, addressing misinformation that's out there. Let's go with Tiffany first, please.
Well, I think that technology has absolutely made our community a very strong international community. As I said earlier, nothing happens in a bubble. And what we, at the international level, at the IPA, constantly advocate is if a company or a research group or anybody is going to put out information, you need to be aware that it's going to go beyond the country you release it in. And so if it's a matter of sending out information about a clinical trial only available in country X, that's fine, but be very black and white in your communication so that you don't have too many questions as follow-up. So I think just an awareness of how international our community is and how interconnected it is incredibly important. In terms of misinformation and all of that, I think it's something that we all struggle with and do the best we can at addressing it when we see it. The difficulty is with social, in the old days when there was the listserv and it was one place where everybody got information, it was much easier to monitor. Now with there being, 10, 20 plus groups and places that people post, it becomes more and more challenging on the patient advocacy side to monitor everything. So it's a matter of relying on each other to be on the lookout as well and correcting incorrect information as you see it and pointing people to each other's websites and to the experts to get the correct information.
Brad, would you like to comment further?
Yeah, I agree with everything that Tiffany said. I think there's, with opportunities come costs and overhead. It takes a lot of time to keep on top of all of these tools that we have out there now. I thought I'd share with you one thing that we've done, or we're doing actually right now, is we're partnering with a company who is developing an app to help patients manage their health data, and doing that in a way that they actually have control of their own data, and in a central place where they can manage it, they can share it with whoever they want to share it with, which could be a new doctor. It could be sharing it through into a clinical trial, a lot of different ways, but they have control of their data. I think there's going to be a lot of other technical opportunities that we have over time that have to do with data, and that's one type of information that isn't the same as when we're talking about social media. So I think we have to kind of keep our eyes open for all the different opportunities. There's so many different technical things that are really cool and make a difference to patients.
That's a nice segue for the last set of questions for Priya and Jordi, Ed, related to technology. Are there particular technologies? It could be diagnosis, it could be a treatment, it could be a treatment both pharmacological or non-pharmacological, or technology such as Brad was just discussing. Is there something on the horizon that could either shift the paradigm of diagnosis and treatment and care for patients? And would it be what might be transformative versus incremental in what you see? Now, I guess I'll ask Jordi to go first, please.
Okay, no problem. So from my point of view, thank you very much for asking me this, because I have spent part of my career working on MRI. So, and the application of muscle MRI to diagnosis and follow-up of patients with different neuromuscular diseases, including Pompe disease. And obviously the technology that has been developed in this field is helping in both aspects of the disease. So just talking a little bit about recent developments, I think that nowadays we have different sequences that can allow us to identify the muscle that is lost and is replaced by fat, and we can follow fat over time. And we have shown that this could be a good outcome measure to follow patients, follow the progression of patients over time. But not only that, there are other sequences that allow us, for example, to identify the presence of water. And we know that when there is glycogen in the muscle, this glycogen retains water, and this can be detected as well. And so MRI can be used to identify progressive accumulation of glycogen in the muscles indirectly through the accumulation of water, or more recently, also directly through with new sequences that allow the direct identification and quantification of glycogen. So from a technological point of view, I would say that muscle MRI is becoming something really interesting in terms of definition of the disease, diagnosis, follow-up, response to treatment, etc. I can say that there are other many different technological advances that can be useful for follow patients as outcome measures. So we now have accelerometers, for example, that can allow us to measure the distance that a patient walk. Not only that, now we have really cool devices that can identify angles of joints, height and length of a step, velocity, acceleration, so many different things, just using a small sensor that can be put, for example, in the spine. So we have more information for sure. And I think that Priya is involved in new clinical trials with recent advances, and probably she can talk better than me about all these new studies that are arriving to the field.
Priya, please.
Thank you so much. So I agree with Jordi, with better diagnostic or better tools to follow the muscle disease rather than the indirect measures. And so muscle MRI definitely, muscle ultrasound, in the developing world would also be helpful. But as a geneticist, also what's really exciting is the exome sequencing and genome sequencing, which is now available, which allows patients to be picked up, just because of untargeted look at the known genes to identify patients who may just present with the limb girdle dystrophy. So I think that has also been a game changer, and now I get many referrals based on that rather than the gene by gene kind of search that's going on. In terms of treatment strategies, there are next generation enzyme treatments which are currently in or have completed phase 3 clinical trials. And I think, the data in the two that have completed phase 3 trials are both promising in the sense that, would benefit some of the patients with Pompe disease, or at minimum is giving them a choice, right? That there's not just one treatment that's available. They have a choice now of 3 enzyme treatments that could benefit them, and an ability to maybe change from one to another based on how they're doing on a current version of the enzyme. Looking ahead, I really believe gene therapy is a reality for us with multiple groups that are working on AAV gene therapy, on lentiviral approaches to gene therapy. So just different approaches of providing the missing gene to the system. There's gene editing that's going on. There's small molecule approaches, and there's also what we call antisense oligonucleotides as another approach. So I didn't once think in my lifetime I would be seeing this kind of choice for patients with Pompe disease. It's just been a remarkable journey. And I think for every patient that I see, whether it's a child or an adult, I always tell them, stay the healthiest that you can, because the field is wide open and the opportunities are there. So
do you think there's roles for thank you. Do you think there's roles for regenerative medicine? And that came up in the course of our prep session, I recall, particularly from Tiffany. So, Tiffany, what would be your dream here in terms of, therapies on the horizon? Well, I don't know if they're on the horizon, but let's say that could be possible one day. Tiffany, would you like to make a comment?
Sure, absolutely. I think definitely regenerative medicine is something that if you ask most patients, we're interested in. And I think most of the medical community would be interested in offering it. And it really goes beyond Pompe to many, many, many diseases. Because for future patients, you have the hope of newborn screening, catching patients early. In the ideal world, everybody's picked up, starts treatment at the absolute correct time. There's the correct treatment, and they never have a symptom of Pompe. But that's the ideal world. And we know we're not living in that world. So for many of us, we live in a world where we were picked up late. Treatment was started late, either there wasn't a treatment or other things got in the way. And so the ability to reclaim lost muscle, because we mentioned current treatments, whether it be enzyme replacement therapy, gene therapy, if the muscle is gone, it's gone right now. So an option that brings back what you've lost, I think, is absolutely of interest, and something we all are hoping to see in the future.
Oh, thank you. So I'd like to just wrap up, and we'll start with Priya, and then go to Jordy, and then we'll come back to our patients at the end of the day. So Priya, please, any thoughts on what the future might look like for you as a physician treating and diagnosing Pompe patients?
Well, I think that future is now for me. Exactly as Stephanie said, I am seeing patients identified by newborn screening. I am able to intervene. I am able to counsel families, and I'm already seeing that now in and it's just been phenomenal to be able to treat at, say, 6 months of age rather than a diagnostic journey of 15 years or 20 years, and seeing remarkable outcomes in the patients that have initiated treatment early.
Thank you. Jordy?
So my wish for the future would be that this reality would be for everybody in this world, that we can have and provide access to this newborn screening and treatments for everybody, regardless of where they live. That would be really great. And it's more a wish than what I think is going to happen in the future, but hopefully this someday is going to be a reality for everybody.
Brad?
I hope that we see universal newborn screening everywhere. I think there's going to be a huge, huge difference. But of course, that's only for the patients diagnosed now. There's a lot that they're already born. So quicker diagnosis, that'll make a huge difference as well. I'm confident that there's so many wonderful minds working on new treatments and therapies that's all going to happen. We all want it to happen faster, but I'm quite encouraged how quickly things are going. So it's awesome.
Thank you, Brad. Tiffany?
Well, I think everybody has basically, shared what I would share. So what I'd like to say is my hope for the future is we continue, as we have been doing for the last 25 years, by collaborating, by working together. And this is going to air on International Pompe Day. And our slogan is, "Together we are strong." And I think that if nothing else, our community has really proven that by collaborating, by talking, by learning from each other, and by working together day after day, year after year, even decade after decade. And that's my hope, that we continue doing that in the decades to come.
Well, thank you. I want to thank...
I could just add one thing. I think our true heroes
yes.
are really Brad and Tiffany. And so I just want to acknowledge that we are where we are. It's only because of this community and the direct, open line of communication that we have with the patient community.
Thank you, Priya. I want to thank Priya, Jordy, and of course I want to thank our patients and patient advocates, Brad and Tiffany, for your participation, and certainly the people who are viewing this session today on April 15th of National Pompe Awareness Day, International Pompe Awareness Day. And so I want to thank all of you for joining us and for spending time with your thoughts to all of our participants here on the panel discussion and to those who are viewing the session as well. Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.